7th day of oversight hearings on executive branch conduct at Waco, and this probably, to everyone's great disappointment, will be a fairly short day. In other words, we hope to be done by 1 o'clock. If we are not done with the panel at 1, there is a markup that will go on, we think, between 1 and 3. We will then recess, subject to the call of the chair, for approximately 2 hours, reconvene, hopefully around 3, and then finish up. In any ways, analysis, I think that's a short day. We'll be having short openings by the chairs and the ranking members, and we will only have one panel today. We have to question a central and much discussed group of a very important group of major people, FBI decision makers. We'll hear from Mr. Larry Potts, the former Assistant Director of the FBI, Criminal Investigations Division. He was a key person at the events at Waco. We'll hear from two individuals we heard from yesterday, Mr. Jeff Jamar, the Special Agent in charge and on-scene commander at Waco, and Mr. Brian Sage, the first FBI hostage negotiator on the scene at Waco. We heard from these two gentlemen yesterday, but today we'll hear from them on a different topic, the FBI decision to insert CS gas into the Davidian compound. Finally, we will hear from two other central decision makers, below the Attorney General and the President. At the Department of Justice, they are Mr. Anthony Betts, the FBI's Unit Chief of Domestic Terrorism, and someone who researched CS gas for the Attorney General, and Mr. Dick Rogers, an Assistant Special Agent in charge and the leader of the FBI's hostage rescue team. I want to say that this is a high-ranking group. These individuals are central to the Justice Department, and they were central to the events at Waco. They are here on their own volition and voluntarily, and that they've come to help us try and sort out the many unanswered questions and unsettled facts. As a joint subcommittee performing our constitutional duty of oversight, we are glad that they have come before us, and we sincerely hope to get to the bottom of what happened and why the decision was made to use CS gas on over 80 Americans. In this process, we think we have come a long way. We've learned new and important facts, and again yesterday, and have put a string in of very late nights. We and the EPA, and you had to be here to understand the significance of that comment, but it's been quite a session. Today, we will explore in public for all America to see the reasoning that went into the disastrous decision to insert CS gas into the Davidian compound, and to do so with tanks and hundreds of canisters, ferret rounds. We will question again the timing and the substance of key pre-gassing conversations between FBI personnel at Waco and those in Washington. We will question who spoke to the Attorney General and who spoke with those close to her. We will ask who decided to use tanks, who gave the order to knock down walls, who sent in dangerous CS gas that ultimately killed infants and young children. We will begin to find out who coordinated those facts, who hastened them, and why those facts were chosen. Were there even vaguely viable alternatives to what was done? Were they rejected? At least we will ask those questions. Thinking about it last night, it occurred to me that the American people have always appreciated persistence, and persistence in the name of truth. Well, there's nothing more important. If no one ever asked these questions, a lot of significant national problems would never have been dug into and brought to light. In almost every case, the result of a sincere oversight effort has been constructive. Of course, difficult questions take extra courage, especially when you ask them of an institution as large and respected as the Department of Justice. But people of good faith, conscience, conviction, patriotic, and interested Americans want their questions answered, and they need this additional information. As we stay the course, I think you'll find that today's fresh panel produces some new findings. As we get closer and closer to the whole picture of what happened and why, today will be a day where we fit in some new pieces into the puzzle. We owe this truth-seeking function to the American people. We serve them, and we do that every day. With them urging us on, we will get the whole picture assembled, or as close as our congressional oversight role will allow. And we thank you all. We have a great deal of respect for the institution you serve. Thank you for being here this morning. Chair now recognizes and introduces the co-chairman of the Joint Subcommittees and chairman of the Judiciary Committee's Crime Subcommittee, our good friend Bill McCollum from Florida.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our panel this morning as we do begin our 7th day of these hearings, and about a very important part of this, the formulation of this assault plan and the rationale behind why it was necessary. But before we do that, I want to at least put the last couple of days of hearings in somewhat of a perspective, at least as I see it. We have walked through very carefully yesterday a long and lengthy hearing on the FBI's beginning role in the negotiations and the siege and what led up to the assault that occurred on April 19th. I think from that lengthy discussion yesterday, it has become apparent to anybody who is watching or listening to this that most of what, if not all of what the FBI was doing on the scene was perfectly up to the keeping of the standards that we would expect from our FBI. We've been very proud of what we've heard in regard to most of this, and I think that all of us up here on this panel, both sides of the aisle, want you and the FBI to know that. I think what we're left with after yesterday, both on that panel and on the discussion of CS gas by those who testified in the second panel last night as to what its effects might be, leave us with a couple of lingering questions that are broad in nature. Not necessarily the only questions, because some, of course, about how this assault developed and what happened as we went into it may well lead to other questions. But the two questions that stand out more than anything else have to do with the advice and information that was provided to the Attorney General, and perhaps questions that might go to the judgment of those who made the ultimate decisions, obviously the Attorney General, and if anyone else was participating in it, their judgment as well. The questions center on the issue of whether or not in the negotiations process the Attorney General fully understood the status of the final days of the negotiations. That is, did she have a sense that was accurate with respect to what Mr. DeGuerin, the attorney representing David Koresh, thought was the opportunity to bring Koresh and his crew out after the 14th of April, before the insertion of the gas on the 19th. Was there indeed information sufficient in her hands to make the judgment call she made that negotiations were truly at an impasse and that to go further would be futile? There are serious questions raised as to whether or not that was the case. I don't doubt for 1 minute that the FBI figures involved that we have testifying before us believe that there was an impasse, believe that David Koresh would not, under any circumstances, come out, that indeed that he wanted to be a martyr. There are, however, others who presented rather compelling testimony that they did not believe that the FBI at that moment, and having been there for many, many days, and having seen David Koresh reject and not live up to his commitments to come out on other occasions, was really listening when they believed that Koresh had found a way through his own interpretations of the book of Revelations and the 7 seals and his own religious views to not be a martyr, but rather instead to be somebody who came out or who had an opportunity to be the messenger of God rather than to be the martyr. Whether or not those interpretations are accurate is beside the point at this juncture. The question is whether or not the full flavor of the status of this opportunity and this state of mind and the belief of those who were involved in that was presented to the Attorney General for her decision making. The second question that's arisen has to do with the CS gas question, and that is whether or not the Attorney General really had sufficient data and information to make the decision on the gas. Did she simply have one outlook on it? Did she fully understand the ramifications of what this would mean to children, potentially? Not necessarily that it was so. We had testimony yesterday that testing simply hadn't been done on children, that we don't have a lot of information or data, but that there certainly is scientific evidence to indicate that if a child takes in this gas, it can affect a child quite differently, especially small children, and the potential for vomiting, the potential for perhaps even dying from asphyxiation as a result of either vomiting or the gas itself was there. The degree to which that was taken into consideration or understood by the Attorney General in her decision-making and those who are around her is not at all clear, and I certainly hope that that's clarified as we move through the next couple of days. This was a crucial decision. Obviously, the lives of a lot of people were at stake, and we would like very much on this panel to know the answer to those questions and to that judgment call about what the Attorney General really knew and what she didn't. Obviously, she will be here with us on Monday to explain what she did and didn't know herself. But it's very important that we walk through the process to gather as much background on on that, as for her as well as for us at this point in time. Today, as Chairman Zeloff has indicated, we're looking forward to hearing from those who planned the gas attack and the assault, and better understand why it was done and what was anticipated, not just from the standpoint of the gas, but the standpoint of the tactics that were involved in this. Thank you very much, Mr. Zeloff.
Thank you, Mr. McCollum. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member of the Crime Subcommittee, our friend Chuck Schumer from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just two procedural points before we begin. One is that last night we were told there'd only be one opening statement, so I, being the shy person that I am, prepared mine, and I'll speak for both Ms. Thurman and myself. It's a joke. Wry attempt at humor. Or a poor attempt at humor, I guess. But in any case, so I'll be giving the opening statement for both of us. Second, we did have a snafu with the witnesses. We awoke this morning to find that one of the witnesses we had requested, who was coming from Aberdeen Labs, the Army's expert on CS gas, was last night unilaterally told by the a majority staffer that he was not on this morning's panel. He will be on tomorrow morning's panel, but we had wanted him on both panels. We talked it over with the majority and came to a decision that rather than hold up the hearings, we would contact that witness immediately. He's at the Aberdeen testing ground, which is about 100 miles from here, and he will join us part of the way through. We believe this was simply a mistake by the majority and no nefarious conspiratorial attempt to deprive us of our God-given rights.
You notice, though, since the beginning and the end, the constructive cooperation on both sides of how we were able to bring this thing together.
Well, I was going to say that was the nice part of my opening statement. Now let me get to the points that I would like to make. I guess there are a couple of points that are beginning to emerge as these hearings unfold, and I'd like to stress a couple of them. One is, I am very concerned with something that many of the critiques on the right about modern America society that I've had some sympathy with seems to be happening here too. There's something called moral relativism, which says there's no right and wrong about anything, that there are just a couple of theories out there and let's weigh them all. Paul Johnson, who's a conservative writer and professor, says this began with Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity. But in any case, I see this exhibited in these hearings in a way that I find disconcerting. Last night was a classic example. Now, by hypothesis, you know, we could have a panel on is the world round or is the world flat? And we could probably find a couple of people who say the world is flat, and then we'd have some expert geographers who say the world is round. And the way things work in modern America, everyone on television would just see some people saying the world is flat and some people saying the world is round, and the next day all the media would say, well, Joe Smith said it was flat, but John Doe rebutted and said it was round, and it would be left there because nobody draws any conclusions. I found that to be the case a bit in last night's panel. We had two of the world's experts on CS gas. They testified tear gas. CS tear gas is what I am attempting to call it, because CS gas has sort of a nefarious ring to it, and this is the mildest form of tear gas available, and it's called CS gas, or CS tear gas. Anyway, we had two of the world's experts who have spent their lives studying this issue. They come from Britain, and they said unequivocally that the gas was not harmful the way it was used for children. And in fact, if you look at the autopsy reports, those horrible reports of everyone who died, there's not a trace found of this gas on any of them. They died in many ways, all the people at Waco. Many of the adults were shot by bullets. Many died by asphyxiation, which could have occurred by fire or other kinds of things. In any case, these experts testified to that extent. Then we had two other people. One was a professor of chemistry at a two-year college in eastern Utah who has done no papers, has no expertise on this kind of gas. The other was an employee in the drinking water section of EPA who also had no expertise, and they, of course, painted more dramatic and dire pictures about what the gas is like. Well, I don't put the 4 witnesses, and then there was a 5th witness who was a very credible witness, Dr. Stone. He's not an expert on CS gas, and he said some troubling things, which I think we're all going to have to weigh. But the 4 witnesses who were experts on the gas were not comparable at all. And it seemed to me that that has happened time and time again. We've had 2 lawyers who were never on the site, who were lawyers who were representing David Koresh, who said the bullets were fired first by the ATF, by them examining a door that is now missing, although the other door has evidence to the contrary, and no one's given any evidence why one door would be different than the other door. And yet, it gets reported there's a dispute about who fired first. We had all the agents who were there. There are 3 reporters, hardly employees of the government, usually looking for skepticism about the government, all on the scene, who said that it was clear that the people in the compound fired first. We have the fact, which hasn't been brought out, that the second time there was an attempt to go to the compound by the FBI, it is clear, everyone agrees the FBI didn't fire a single shot, and yet they were met with a fusillade of gunfire that came from within the compound. There are things in dispute here. There are mistakes that were made. I think that the panel that was the most devastating for the government was the one with Sarabin and Wojnacki and all of those people, and it came clear, and this panel has done, this committee has done a service by showing that the elements of surprise was lost, and the raid went forward anyway with the ATF. Now, we've known that before, but as I've said time and time again, to make it public in a televised hearing, fine. This hearing will make sure that doesn't happen again. I dare say that in any federal agency with a large raid like this, when surprise is lost, they won't do it. But then to get into extraneous, I mean, to sort of equate the 2 lawyers with all the others on the scene and say this is in dispute, or the experts on CS gas with 2 people, I don't know where they came from, but they have as little expertise or almost as little expertise on the issue of CS gas, tear gas, as I do, and say this is in dispute, we have to examine this, etc. To me, something is wrong. And that is why we in the minority have had trouble with how the panels were set up. That is why we in the minority have some dubiousness about the mission here. Not simply to bring out the truth, but for some to air theories that have been widely discredited, that are held by a few people who believe in conspiracies against the government. And it fans those flames. And that's not good. So I would ask everybody, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the people listening to this out in America, the media in particular, this is serious stuff. And the idea of just saying that theories that are flimsy have the same weight as theories that are backed up by witness after witness after witness is a real problem. I would make 2 other points. That's my most fundamental point. A second point I would make is related to that. And this one may get some people on, some of my colleagues upset, but I'm going to say it. We hear everyone professing, we're on the side of law enforcement. We want to help law enforcement. And as I said, these hearings can, because anyone who's on the side of law enforcement doesn't give them a carte blanche, just as I believe the SEC has been the best thing that happened to Wall Street by keeping them honest. Having oversight of law enforcement agencies by outside groups, including panels like these, does the same. But when you say you're for law enforcement in your opening, and then you reach for the most implausible of theories and sort of try to blame law enforcement, I don't think you're really being for law enforcement, okay? If you really back up law enforcement, you don't say that 2 defense lawyers who were not on the scene are more credible than 20 law enforcement officers and several reporters who were on the scene. You don't say that a professor from eastern Utah in a 2-year school who has no expertise on this and a rather controversial employee in the water division of the EPA is the same as the two world experts. What you're doing is giving the benefit of the doubt not to law enforcement, but against law enforcement when you do it. If you want to do that, fine. Lots of people on my side of the aisle have done that for many years. But it's not fair to say you're for law enforcement and then take every wacky theory and use it as a club with which to beat law enforcement over the head. So, Mr. Chairman, those are my points. I appreciate the time to give them and hope we'll have an interesting day.
Mr. Schumer, I'm sure we will, and I'd like the record to show that you had about an equal amount of time on both sides here in the opening statements. I'd now like to introduce the panel. To my left, your right, Mr. Larry Potts, former Assistant Director of the FBI Criminal Investigations Division. Next to him is Mr. Anthony Betts, was the Unit Chief of Domestic Terrorism at the Federal Bureau of Investigations and Research, CS-GAS, for the FBI. I'm sorry. Let me go back. Next to him was Mr. Jeffrey Jamar, was the Special Agent in charge of San Antonio, Texas, and on-scene FBI commander at Waco. Mr. Dick Rogers, in the middle, Assistant Special Agent in charge and the leader of the FBI hostage rescue team at Waco, Texas. And Mr. Brian Sage was the Supervisory Senior Resident Agent, Austin Resident Agency, and the first FBI hostage negotiator on the scene at Waco. Welcome back again today. And let's see, and I guess I already introduced Mr. Betts, Unit Chief of Domestic Terrorism at the Federal Bureau of Investigations and Research, CS-GAS, for the FBI. Dr. Harry Salem, Ph.D., will be joining the panel when he can get here, as the Chief of Life Sciences Department Research and Technology Directorate at the U.S. Army Edgewood Research, Development, and Engineering Center for the Department of Defense. Gentlemen, if you would, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this oversight subcommittees is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record show that the answers were in the affirmative. The chair now recognizes Mr. Schiff from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before asking questions of this panel, I'd like to talk about yesterday's panel with respect to CS-GAS. I have to say first that I think the credentials of some of the witnesses were understated. For example, Mr. Marcus of the Environmental Protection Agency testified that his Ph.D. was based on, or based in part on, a study of inhalation toxicology. Second of all, it is significant that when I asked the British experts upon whom Mr. Schumer said we should place the most reliance, to their knowledge, has the British government ever come up with a plan to insert gas into a building for 48 hours? Or has the British government ever come up with a plan to insert CS-GAS into a building where they knew were children and infants? They both said no. So I think it's extremely interesting that the experts that we're told are the superior experts in this subject can't cite an example of where their government did exactly what our government did in this particular situation. Mr. Jamar, sir, I have a couple of follow-up questions from yesterday, if I may. I want you to know again that every member of both of these subcommittees of both parties wishes that there had been no loss of life at all in that situation. And we hope that these hearings will at least produce enough knowledge that it won't occur again. But I want to ask you a question based upon Dr. Stone's testimony, because he mentioned your name specifically, said to ask you. Dr. Stone, who was on the Attorney General's review panel, said that if the Branch Davidians, being armed, it is said, with automatic weapons, including a .50 caliber machine gun, had wanted to kill ATF agents for the sake of killing ATF agents, that they could have done so with automatic weapons. They could have literally wiped out the entire group as they were disembarking from the trucks and so forth, and said to ask you about that. Would you respond, please?
Well, I'd heard about that, and I'm wondering what our discussion, he called me, 2 years ago almost, I guess, or more than 2 years ago to discuss his part of the study group he was on. I think the discussion was really, there's no question that the Branch Davidians intended to kill ATF aides. They wouldn't have been firing automatic weapons at them when they approached and throwing hand grenades at them. That's not the question. I think that the context of the discussion was, I think by the grace of God, more ATF agents weren't killed. I think maybe if, please let me finish my thought here. I think one thing, probably part of our discussion was that, thank goodness there was a ceasefire. Thank goodness that, as Jim Kavanaugh described so graphically yesterday, they were able to get wounded agents like Kenny King out of there before he died. But I think to infer that that there's something redeeming about the fact that they didn't kill more ATF agents is ridiculous.
You don't agree then with Dr. Stone that they could have killed more if they had wanted to? That's
well, I
what
think they could have killed more without question. I think they killed as many as they could until the ceasefire. I think there's any question about that.
Is it true that all the agents who died were on the roof, as Dr. Stone
Not so.
said?
One agent was shot out front and behind a van, and the other one was shot behind the safe, both shot right in the head.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask about your testimony from yesterday. When the issue was whether the FBI was correct to move and try to end the siege or should have waited, I believe that you personally said, I would have waited a year if I had anything to hang a hook on with that. Do you remember saying that?
Yes, sir.
What would it have taken for you to wait further? What would you have expected to have found?
As far as, let's use the preparation of the manuscripts as an example, that we are preparing, they're finished, we're going to send the disc out in 2 hours. Steve Snyder said, I've just received it, I'm editing it, I may not get it to you till tomorrow, but I am definitely editing something, we've got something.
If you had believed that time is running short, if you had believed that when he finished the manuscripts, he would have come out, would you have waited and not recommended the attack?
Absolutely.
Well, let me ask then, what about the abuse of the children, sexual abuse or other abuse that was going on inside the compound in your judgment? I've been told that that was a reason for advising a forceful end of the siege. If that was a reason for ending the siege, why would you have waited for Mr. Koresh to have finished his manuscripts if you believed he would really have come out?
Well, I think if I'd believed if he was giving me something such as a manuscript, let's get that met. One of the fears I had was that he was never going to do that, and when he was through the manuscript, then he would do something provocative. However, let's use the children. Let's say we asked for a tape of the children to force them to clean the children if they weren't already clean. Show us that they're nice and healthy. Show us that. If that would have been the case, let's say if I said wait a year, if they would have given us some children, show us that these children are healthy. Show us that the inside, that the sanitation and the threat of disease is not what we think it is. Demonstrate that to us by sending people out who are in good health.
But just to conclude, you're now saying that if Mr. Koresh really, in your judgment, was going to come out after writing his manuscript, you would have given that additional time, even though previously it's been said that because of abuse of children, not neglect, but of actual sexual assault and child rape, we had to move fast. And
no, don't isolate it to one reason, that the threat of the children's health, the threat of disease, and the fact that we could very easily infer that his previous abuse would continue was one factor. There were many, many factors. That was just one.
Okay, I think my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Scott from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We went over some of this yesterday, and I just want to reiterate. Mr. Betts, what is your position with the FBI?
Currently the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Baltimore Division.
And do you have any special expertise?
In CS gas?
I have operational expertise as a Marine officer, a police officer, and 5 years with the hostage rescue team.
Is it used very often?
It's quite commonly used in law enforcement and it's been commercially available, I believe, since 1958.
Do you know of any deaths that have occurred as a direct result?
No, sir, I don't. There is still no documented death that is unequivocally attributable to CS.
Now, are there other gases, so-called tear gases? Are there alternative gases?
Yes, there are.
CN,
Yes, sir.
And OC?
Yes, sir. CN, the Bureau does not maintain CN in the inventory because there are deaths that can be documented scientifically attributable to CN.
What about OC gas?
I'm sorry, sir.
OC, pepper spray?
Oh, oleoresin capsicum?
Has the safety of that been documented?
Nothing's been nearly extensively studied at CS.
Is there any question amongst experts as to which tear gas is the safest?
There is no question among experts who I've contacted that CS is by far the safest and most extensively studied.
So if gas were to be used, there would be no question amongst experts which gas it ought to be?
There's been no question among experts that I've contacted. Based on last night, I think there'd be questions depending on your experts.
Now, the plan to insert the gas and the amount of gas inserted, is there any question whether or not a lethal amount of gas was inserted into the compound?
There is no question, based on calculations that I observed over many hours performed by British scientists, given the knowns at Waco, that being the volume of the building, the ventilation, and in fact, the ventilation was very much understated when Dr. Rice, in testimony last night, said what really happened. What he was referring to was we based all our calculations on low ventilation, just to ensure an extra safety factor in the calculations. But anyone who knows the conditions over the 51 days, and including that day, would know that in that area of Texas there is a steady wind commonly through the day, so low ventilation was unrealistic, but we still use that.
Now, everybody knows what ended up happening at the end. Who was involved in the actual decision? Mr. Jamar, you were involved in the decision to go forward. What did you expect what happened to have happened?
No, we feared it. We didn't expect that.
Okay,
We were
now
hopeful that the CS gas would drive them from the compound.
so you knew that there was a chance that Koresh, because of his beliefs, might use the opportunity to kill everybody?
Yes, sir.
You knew that was a possibility?
We feared that. Yes, sir.
What weight was given to that possibility?
Tremendous weight, and that was why we took so long to come to that decision. But there was the other side, as we discussed yesterday, is that do we let him determine when he was going to do it, and what measures could we take, such as 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a breakout with a child under each hand, by firing, or starting a fire, or whatever it might be. What measures could we take at that time when we're not prepared? The idea was to try to do this in the safest manner, was to do it where we were best prepared, and we, with the medical care and everything we had available there. And the theory on the gas is that we would do it incrementally and make the place uninhabitable. The thought that people would be breathing gas for 48 hours is not correct. The idea was they would move away from the areas where gas.
Well, what are the chances? What chance did you give to the possibility that they might die as a result of what you did, as they might be rescued as a result of what you did?
Well, I think we wouldn't have done it if we didn't think that the odds of their being rescued outweighed the fear of mass murder or suicide. What we're trying to do is preempt his being Koresh, deciding when it was going to happen. What he did, he decided it was going to happen on April 19th. But I am firmly convinced that ultimately he was going to, that end would be there. But we thought our opportunity to save lives was best if we dictated when an action was taken, not Koresh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Satter. 5 minutes.
I wanted to say for the record that I'm getting tired of Mr. Schumer questioning to the point of smearing us about our commitment to law enforcement. Mr. Heineman was chief of police in Raleigh. Mr. Brandt was a U.S. attorney in Tennessee. Mr. Shattuck was an assistant attorney general in Arizona. Mr. Barr was a U.S. attorney in Georgia. I have never been a defense attorney in my life. In fact, I write in my campaign that I'm not an attorney. I've always been committed to law enforcement. We are trying to ask questions. I'm sorry if in the process of asking questions, what happens in the Rodney King case and in others, that in fact it sometimes sets back law enforcement because there's so much focus as you're trying to sort through the different process, but it isn't going to intimidate me from trying to get to that point, and I hope you realize that it is not helpful to those of us who've been long committed to it, to our support for it, to be constantly accused because we're trying to do our job in oversight. Mr. Betts, I wanted to ask you some questions. Understanding that you're predominantly a tactical CS expert and not a scientific, you can perhaps at least answer for me and explain if you didn't directly, who would have directly, and what went to the people who made the decision regarding the gas. Of what did you take into consideration of the dangers of gassing children? Was it that it's okay to gas them, that no evidence exists that showing it's dangerous, or that in fact evidence exists that shows that it isn't dangerous? What was the discussion around the gassing of children, and how was that debated internally?
Yes, sir. The discussions I had were primarily with Dr. Harry Salem from the U.S. Army Chemical Research, Development, and Education Center in Edgewood, Maryland, which is the singular center, to the best of my knowledge, in the United States for expertise in that area. And children were very heavily discussed, and I attempted to read every paper Dr. Salem gave me, and he certainly read, I believe he queried almost 500 individual research reports. In those reports, including the Hemsworth report that was mentioned last night, there were references to children who'd been exposed. In Great Britain, those children who were exposed in enclosed areas recovered upon exposure to air. In the instance that was mentioned last night, which is the Park and Giamona study in 1972 in California, I'm also familiar with that report, and that child was admitted to the hospital and recovered with antibiotics in 28 days. And that was, in all the research that's been cited, including by Dr. Stone, that was the only instance of a child being admitted to the hospital that I'm aware of.
Is it standard operating procedure as you're inserting the gas gradually to do it over several days?
That would actually add quite a safety factor to inserting gas in any situation.
Had you discussed in your briefing that you might sharply accelerate that process if the tank was fired upon?
What I'm familiar with is that there was also a backup plan that if the tanks were fired upon, there was an alternative plan to utilize ferret rounds in addition to the insertion point.
And did the discussion, when you were talking about the impact of gas on the children, calculate that if you accelerated the process, that it would potentially have more impact? And also, could you talk a little bit about, did you discuss the disorienting impact on the parents and their children as to whether they'd be able to see and get nauseous, be able to find their way out?
Yes, sir. That was discussed very much, and I questioned Dr. Salem on that myself. And I went over the most common effects of CS, and there is an effect that causes you to blink extensively, but the most common effects and the effects that it's intended to have are sensory irritant effects, which is what we desired. There's no effect there that I'm aware of that would cause someone to not be able to escape the environment, which is actually the intention.
Mr. Jamar, I was really interested yesterday. I think you said 7 of the 9 people who did in fact come out either came out through one of the holes or were directly rescued. Does that suggest, did anybody come out through the routes that you thought they were going to come out?
No one came out that looked like to me compelled by the gas, tear gas. I didn't see that, but I don't know of the 9 whether how much gas that they touched. I don't know that.
My question is that because the walls were knocked down, you said that's how many of them got out. Does that suggest that they couldn't find their way out otherwise?
No, the only point there was at the front door, I think the context of the question was, why did you knock holes in the walls? That was the context, was that the door was blocked. The front door that they used all the time, we discovered by trying to open it. We were wondering why aren't any people coming out? So we had one of the CEVs push the door, and we discovered it was blockaded. So we made a another door. We couldn't see out the back. There were doors out the back. And we could never get in there by the pool there. The picture's here, but you know what? You remember what I'm talking about, the swimming pool.
Yes, I know what you're...
We were afraid to go in there because the concrete was so weak and the heavy weight of the tank would maybe fall down in there. So we made a hole around the back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Conyers, 5 minutes.
Gentlemen, just one word in observance of the nature of these hearings across this week. No one on either of these two committees has been a more forceful critic of law enforcement than myself. I've been doing it more often and longer than anyone on the committee. I talked to Secretary Rubin and Undersecretary Noble about the Old Boys Roundup and the environment in ATF, which is more important than the event itself, that leads to these things being summarily happening. I've talked to 3 or 4 FBI directors in the course of my career about the discrimination in employment. I've been talking to Mrs. Meisner in Immigration and Naturalization Service about the longest outstanding and largest class action suit that African American agents have brought against any federal agency in history, and we're trying to take care of that. I go back in U.S. attorneys to attorney generals to Levy and others. I'm shocked that the Department of Justice would try to weaken the exclusionary rule. I've opposed U.S. attorneys who try to run their trials by press release, intimidating defense witnesses and people brought before the criminal justice system. But Waco has to stand in an examination on its own merit. That's the subject that brings us here today. And I think that the whole event now has been made clear. Here was the most massive assault on law enforcement that's ever been unleashed, taken by surprise, pulling up all that weaponry and firepower did not intimidate Koresh and the Davidians one bit. And it's out of that tragedy and the strategies that bring us here today and the question of gas. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Sage, in the transcripts where you were, in fact, helping, they were recorded with your comments and other unidentified people inside. There was some suggestion that all of the references to you want it poured, it's poured already, should we light the package now? Yeah, okay, light it. You got to put the fuel in there too. This was casually dismissed, total hearsay, by lawyers that were admitting they were representing Koresh, that this was referring to pouring gas in Molotov cocktails. Can you help us clear that up?
It's, I believe, the clear indication from a reading of the transcript would indicate that it was not, at least it's clear to me, that they were preparing that compound for an apocalyptic end. Unfortunately, that certainly was not our intent.
Were there any Molotov cocktails thrown?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did you know about any inside the compound?
No, sir, not until after assessment of the record here.
And finally, in terms of the strategy on the gas, I think it was Mr. maybe Dick Rogers. There was initial plan to have the gradual insertion of gas, but at some point it was determined that it should be introduced, excuse me, in larger quantities. Can you help us get some understanding of that strategy there, or the change of strategy that may have occurred?
Yes, sir. That was not really a change in strategy. We had factored in a contingency that should our vehicle be met with gunfire when it went up to make the initial insertion, then the only thing we could do is to respond with additional ferret rounds of tear gas in order to try to reduce the fire coming towards our vehicles. Everyone has made the assumption that because we had military armored vehicles that the agents inside were completely safe, and that's just not true. In order to fire those ferret rounds, there were openings in the sides of those Bradley fighting vehicles that we had actually enlarged from what their original design was for the military.
What was the purpose for that?
Well, the purpose was so that our agents could be able to aim their 40-millimeter gas guns through the openings and be able to accurately put those ferret rounds into their targets. If you can shoot out, you can also shoot in, and that was our concern with the safety of our people in there. If a round came into that Bradley, it's going to ricochet around inside that armored vehicle, and clearly we're going to have casualties among the FBI agents. So when they started opening fire with automatic weapons, we saw green tracers coming out of that building, then we went to what we call a compromise plan, which was to go ahead and put ferrets in all those openings.
To insert more gas rather than...
To insert more gas. They forced us basically to back off of this very phased, very carefully thought out plan to deny portions of that building over a period of 48 hours.
And had they not opened fire, you would have had a gradual insertion of the gas.
Yes, sir, and let me also clear up one thing. The plan was never to insert gas for 48 hours. The plan was to insert gas over a period of 48 hours, which is a big difference.
To talk about, just in concluding, Mr. Chairman, what is the difference there?
Well, the difference is we were only going to put so much gas into the building. All of the calculations that the experts have used is based on putting gas into a place and measuring its effect within a 1-minute period. We're talking about 48 hours that we were going to continue this operation. Huge difference. If you take into account the wind that we had there blowing across that plain in Texas, my personal opinion is that gas had very little, if any, effect on anyone inside. I think it was quickly ventilated as soon as we put it in there.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bryant, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions, and if you could keep your answers as short as possible. Mr. Jamar, I was kind of cut off on my time last night, but did I understand you testified yesterday that the President of the United States was aware of this basically siege plan, but wanted to know of any change, wanted to be made aware of any change in that strategy? Was that in your notes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and I assume that you assumed by briefing Justice and the FBI that the President, it wasn't your job to call the President and tell him you were fixing to go in with tanks, but you assumed that the other folks, your superiors, would do that.
We're talking about two different times, Mr. Bryant. I think at the beginning I was told that the President said that don't do anything beyond negotiation without going back to him unless there's an emergency.
Okay. And there was never an emergency.
Okay.
There was never an emergency, was there?
During the period, no, we didn't have one that would make us depart from that. Not at all, sir.
Now, I would interpret that to mean that he wanted to know in the future. He didn't have, he didn't limit that to a week or whatever. He just said unless there's a change.
Well, I think one of the changes that occurred was by I think March 12th, we have an Attorney General now. It wasn't, remember, the normal hierarchy of an administration didn't exist on February 28th.
Well, you had an acting Attorney General, Mr. Gerson, and you had the transition team, Mr. Hubble, leading that, who was Mr. Clinton's.
Well, that's my point is, sir, that had there everyone been in place, we wouldn't have been told the President, we would have been told the Attorney General said this. There's a huge difference in my mind.
But you're not saying the President was dealing directly with you at the
No, sir, I'm sorry.
I mean, there were people in
my
between.
point is, in the normal times, like today, if something like that occurred, and there were special instructions from the Attorney General, or from the President would be to the Attorney General, and it would be reported to me that the Attorney General said, do this.
Okay. Let me move on if I could. And I've got another question for you, Mr. Jamar. Ms. Sparks from the Texas Human Services Department testified that she had been asked by the FBI to plan a contingency plan for showers and stuff to clean these children after they were gassed, and that right before this occurred, this was canceled. Do you know why this idea of having medical aid and showers for children?
No, the decontamination of everyone coming out was there. It was stayed in place.
Okay.
And they were the survivors were decontaminated.
By FBI?
No, by medical personnel.
Okay, but the Texas people were not using it. That was my point. She left the impression with me that this contingency plan had just been canceled, at least as far as her
That's not
involvement.
correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Potts, did you play a role in the formation of this plan that included the gas insertion?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. And what information, and I guess and how frequently, did you pass on this information to the Department of Justice?
That's not an easy question to answer in short term. I mean, in terms of formation of the gas plan, I think that Mr. Jamar first contacted me probably around March 27th or somewhere near the very end of March to indicate that such a plan was being submitted. There were extensive internal discussions that went on for a period of a couple of weeks.
Okay, now let me move on. Internal to the FBI.
Yes.
Was April the 12th the first time that Main Justice knew about this plan that included the gas insertion?
I'm not
was that
sure.
the first date?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure that April 12th was the first time they knew. It was the first time that we had briefed them. I believe that they knew as a result of a visit that Floyd Clark, the Deputy Director, and I had made to Waco on the 7th and 8th, that discussions were being held regarding possible insertion of gas.
Who is they in Justice knew this?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I think that, first of all, I think there was Mark Richard, there was Mr. Reynolds, Jim Reynolds, there was Mr. Hubble, and eventually the Attorney General probably knew as of the 9th that there were discussions going on within the FBI. And we had asked then the Director Sessions at the time, had asked on the 9th of April for a meeting with the Attorney General on the 12th to brief her on what our plan was.
Thank you very much. I believe my time is up.
Ms. Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Jamar, in the response to my last question, you indicated that you knew that there was a real chance that there was loss of life might occur, but you believed that the catastrophic ending would eventually occur sometime.
Based on his conduct on the 19th.
I would trust that you would have more than just speculation to justify your action and have a solid foundation for your belief that the risk of loss was justified. I'm going to just pose the question. I don't want to take any more of Ms. Collins' time, but as you answer the other questions, I would be very interested in what kind of foundation you had for that belief to justify the loss of life. And I thank the lady from Illinois for yielding.
Thank you. Yesterday, we heard from yet another witness, Dr. Alan Stone, that representatives of the National Rifle Association contacted him, posing as a staff member of this committee. The chairman of the Government Reform Committee has declined my repeated request that we call individuals to testify as to their activities which may have interfered with these hearings. As a member of Congress, I fully believe that we have an obligation to ensure that allegations of unethical or illegal activity are investigated, particularly when they affect a congressional hearing. Because the chairman has not responded to my last request to pursue these allegations, I intend to forward this information to the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia for review for possible criminal violations, because I think it's extremely important that we do so. Let me say this too. I'm concerned about the decision to use gas on the compound, not because I believe that David Koresh and his followers were coming out on their own, but because there were children in the compound. Anytime children are exposed or to be exposed to a chemical such as tear gas, I certainly want to know about it. The thing that concerns me the most about this, however, is that there has been conflicting issues here. So the issue that needs to be addressed is the alternatives that were available to the FBI. First, would the children have been safer staying in the compound while other options were pursued, or was exposure to gas the safest option? I'm going to ask whoever wants to answer that one. Mr. Jamar?
Yes, ma'am. As I tried to describe earlier, the concern we had was that starting in around the 24th, 25th of March there, that we thought that negotiations were at an impasse, that there's no indication of anything at that time in the short term changing anything, that he would begin to let people come out or he would change his attitude in any way. So we said, what are our options? What options do we have to prevent him from causing the deaths of those people inside? Law enforcement has very limited options that are non-lethal. We never contemplated assaulting the compound and making an entry absent indication that he was systematically killing people inside there. We never contemplated except in those circumstances. The options left to law enforcement are limited to insertion of CS gas. That's just about it. So we started discussing, well, if he decides on his terms that he wants to destroy those people inside, how would we stop him? We would stop him with CS gas. So we said, well, to keep him from doing that on his terms and his timetable, then maybe the best thing to do is to try to preempt that by driving the people from the compound by the use of CS gas.
Attorney General Reno made the decision to allow the insertion of CS tear gas only after meeting with a number of experts outside the Department of Justice, and one of those was Dr. Harry Salem, who was an expert on the use of tear gas for the Department of Defense, and a witness who was scheduled for this panel. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Rogers about that meeting, and I want to know what the questions were that the Attorney General asked about the use of the gas against the children, and what advice Dr. Salem and the other members of the meeting gave her, please.
Yes, ma'am. I was at that meeting. Attorney General Reno quizzed Dr. Salem very extensively. She was extremely concerned about the children. She asked a number of probing questions of the doctor. He responded that, and I don't want to speak for him, but my memory of that meeting was that basically there had never been a documented case of a child or anyone else dying from CS tear gas, that the military had done extensive testing on it, and basically he allayed her fears that the CS tear gas was toxic or that it would kill anyone inside that compound, particularly in the amounts that we anticipated putting in there. So my impression in walking away from that meeting was that she was satisfied with the answer she got from the doctor, and that we had reached out to what we thought was the very best opinion and legal expert, I mean not legal expert, scientific expert in this area in the United States, and he had provided those answers to her.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chief Heineman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Potts, on February the 28th, what was your position in the hierarchy?
I was the Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigative Division at FBI headquarters.
Were you Mr. Jamar's direct connect with the hierarchy?
Yes, sir, I was.
And who were you responsible to?
I reported to Doug Gow, who was the Associate Deputy Director.
Okay. And as per yesterday's testimony, Mr. Jamar said he spoke to you frequently as to the situation in Waco.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to, I was cut off by the red light yesterday at Mr. Jamar's level. Mr. Jamar, I spoke to you yesterday and asked you about the siege situation as to whether you considered that a hostage situation.
Yes, sir.
And your response to me was, no, you considered that a barricaded criminal situation.
Yes.
And certainly it was. There were barricaded criminals in there. Mr. Rogers, and I would ask Gary Nessner if he was here, do you have a protocol for barricaded situations where there are children involved at that time?
We do not have written protocols that you go to, and I'm not trying to be flip, but as a recipe book where you pick a particular situation and you flip to it, and we've got written contingency plans specifically. Everything I've been involved in 25 years in the FBI is almost unique in itself. Every hostage barricade situation is different. A
lot of variables.
A lot of variables. A lot of different, generally different people, different situations, and it's all variable.
Well, I realize you have to, as they say, go by the seat of your pants at a lot of these situations because of variables. And certainly we're looking to improve the process.
Yes, sir. I wouldn't classify it as seat of our pants. I mean, we have very extensive training of our personnel. We have very good intelligence staff. And when we make a decision, it's not a seat of the pants decision. And
well, you have to make the decision based on the variables.
And the facts at hand.
Right.
Yes, sir.
And hopefully, based on what we've learned here yesterday and what we'll talk about the next couple of days, the use of CS gas and any other type ordinance as it relates to children. I hope that your section of the FBI, the training section, has taken everything, or will take everything that's mentioned at these hearings into consideration and develop some kind of a greater sensitivity to infants. Now, certainly you don't know how CS gas affects children. I think there was testimony last night amongst the PhDs that none of them knew how CS gas would affect a child under 2. But I think that's something we need to seriously think about in light of what's happened. I don't know how it affects children. So I was in no better position to judge that than Mr. Jamar or Mr. Potts or his superiors. But I would like to think we could leave here with the lesson learned to give great consideration, even if it's not experimentation, but further study into the effect of ordinance on even small children. And I'll yield the balance of my time to Mr. Saba.
There's not much time left. Mr. Jamar, it seemed pretty predictable that they were going to fire in the tanks, and didn't it seem predictable also they were going to barricade the door? Was that the primary place you thought they were going to come out?
Well, if they believed we were going to try to enter the compound, and the way the overhears sounded, like there was one comment, we're going to wait until they come in before we light this. There was a comment on the over. I don't think they'd had the door barricaded because they wanted us to come in.
Did you
I think the idea was to keep people from going out, not to keep us from going in, just to keep people from going out.
That was fairly predictable,
right.
Given some. Didn't you?
Well, I
have
don't think that's necessarily predictable. I'm just saying it's easy to conclude that after the fact.
Well, we have all kinds of things that said you thought they were maybe mass suicide.
There were other doors too. But I'm thinking that get back to your first thing about them firing on. I believed it was 99% when we approached with the tank they would fire. I believe that. Not all people agree with me on that, but I believe that at the time. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Sheila Jackson Lee, from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and good morning to the gentlemen that are there with us this morning. Let me make a couple of remarks before I ask maybe 2 very abbreviated questions. I hope as we continue to unfold the facts in these proceedings, and we're now almost to an end, we can keep before us 2 procedural prongs of the fork. That is that we are fact finders, bringing to the table, whether they're witnesses or whether we are congresspersons, our own biases and insight and review. The second point is that we owe a responsibility to the American people to be problem solvers, and that the only way we can do so is to probe your minds and to try to understand what went on. We were not there. And we've heard a discourse of disparate voices about who's believing what or what side of the aisle is more pro-law enforcement or not. Interestingly, the irony of voices from the American public, maybe people who would have said completely different things if we were having a hearing on the NRA, are now making strange accusations because they think people are biased. But if we can keep before us those two prongs, facts as best we can with human frailties, and then to resolve it, I hope you will give me your true and honest answer. You're obviously sworn in, you're obviously law enforcement officers, so that we can keep that before us and as well make good of these proceedings, which I believe have started in the best interest of the American public. But I would simply say to you that those of us who've been accused one way or the other can say certain points about law enforcement. Did I agree with COINTELPRO that permeated the civil rights movement some years ago? No. Was I skeptical about the onslaught of law enforcement in the peace movement, student peace movement? I raised my voice of opposition. Was I satisfied that the Black Panthers were truly conspirators to undermine the government? No. And so I raised my voice in concern of that. Or the worst of all, evidence by local police in the filmed version of what happened to Rodney King. Did we raise our voices against that? Yes, we did. And I'm certainly against in local communities young black men being arrested for walking on the wrong side of the street. However, I think we need to be balanced. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge the efforts that have been made when young freedom riders rode into the Deep South, that they had to rely upon federal law enforcement to protect their rights, carrying forth the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. I think we have to realize when bright African-American students tried to enter universities in the Deep South, federal law enforcement had to provide that safety net. And I think we also need to acknowledge when a very vital voice to our entire community, this nation, was silenced by a deadly force, Dr. Martin Luther King. We didn't know whether this nation would be able to withstand that blow, along with the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and yes, the attack on Ronald Reagan. Federal law enforcement had to take its role. So I think when we begin to look at this issue, let us balance the good and the bad. And my question that I'd like all of you to answer, twofold again. On the CNS gas, was the effort to provide an opportunity for those children and those women and those men to come out? Tell me the plan. And then two, why did you not wait? Taxpayers' dollars or not, why did you not wait? Mr. Potts, and I'd like all of the witnesses to answer those questions, please.
First of all, CS gas was chosen because we believe it to be the absolute least harmful of any of a gas, that it would not be harmful to the children, that it would not be harmful to people in there, but it would drive them out of the house. You have to understand that when this plan was first formulated and we talked about the impact on the children, we went to experts to find out how will this impact on the kids. And even after finding out from the experts that they didn't believe the CS gas would be harmful to the children, we then put in certain other aspects in the plan which would build in extra safety aspects for the kids. For instance, there was a very active discussion when Mr. Clark and I went to Waco to talk about how this plan was going to go about. Dick Rogers of HRT was very concerned, as you just heard, about the safety of his people being fired upon. If they started firing from inside the compound, his people were going to be very much exposed to that. If they would have had the perfect plan for them in order of safety for the HRT agents, it would not have included an advanced warning, because that just gives people a chance to get their weapons to aim and to be ready.
And you might have to aim back and shoot and kill someone.
That's right. That's right. And so the advanced warning was something that we talked about an awful lot as to whether how much safety are we giving up for the agents. But we did that advanced warning because we wanted to make sure that they knew what we were doing and to give them a chance to get the children and bring them out of the compound. Now, if you say, well, why should they take them out of the compound at that point? What if they said, we're not going to leave this compound? The other thing that we talked about and discussed was that during a several-hour firefight that you heard described so graphically the other day by Mr. Kavanaugh, during that entire firefight, not a single child was harmed. All those bullets that were going back and forth, and not one child was harmed. Where were the children during the firefight? Children were probably in some place that was safe. You're giving them advance warning. They can either bring them out of the compound or they can put the children somewhere that's safe. That was another safety aspect that we thought about that would give them a chance to save the children from any exposure. The third aspect of that plan that I think was built around safety to the children and not safety to our agents. Safety to our agents, the best would have been to put all the gas in at one time. The military advised us that, HRT advised us of that, and several of the SACs on site absolutely demanded that it all be put in at one time for the safety of our agents. You're going to get an agent killed if you try to do this thing incrementally. But again, for the safety of those people inside, and particularly for the safety of the children, we decided that what we wanted to do was not try to bring this thing to an end on April 19th. April 19th was not any kind of a D-Day where we said we've got to end this thing right now. April 19th was to put some gas in one portion of that compound and then back away. They can go to another part of the compound. They can go to another place that doesn't have gas. But what it does is hopefully begin to limit the area of that compound that they have access to. And at the same time, provide an opportunity for some of those people who are inside to come out. An excellent chance for that to occur. The rules of engagement during the operation itself. And I'm sorry I'm going on, but all of this, I think, is important for the children. The rules of engagement, when we started to put the gas in, the Attorney General talked to the director and to Floyd Clark and everyone else and